In this podcast, Walt Rakowich talks about Transfluence, how to lead in transformative times. So stay tuned. Welcome everyone to Work 2.0 podcast. Today we have with us an amazing guest and an amazing story. And I think I would love to get on the conversation very soon. So I welcome Walt Rakowich in our conversation. So he's a leader, speaker, and former executive at Prologis, a global real estate company that was near collapse when he took over as CEO in 2008. During the economic downturn, the Prologis stock has dropped from over $70 per share to approximately $2 per share in just mere 10 months, making it the third worst performing company in S&P 500. After Walt joined as CEO, he quickly implemented a change in culture through transparency, orchestrating a dramatic turnaround and restoring its position in the industry. He is also the author of Transfluence, How to Lead with Transformative Influence in Today's Climate of Change, which is about to release in September end. In addition to speaking to audience on a range of leadership topic, Walt also serves on a number of corporate and philanthropic boards. Before starting his business career, Walt attended a Penn State University where he received his BS in accounting. He went on to earn his MBA from Harvard Business School. In his free time, Walt enjoys traveling, mentoring youth, and participating in a wide range of community service initiatives. He and his wife Sue have 2 adult children and reside in Colorado. With that, Walt, welcome to the conversation.
Great to be on, Vishal. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
So I think this is a pretty nice package, right? So walk us through your journey.
Okay. I'd be happy to do so. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is how I ended up going to Penn State. And I'm a grandson of European immigrants, actually, that came over. I'd like to focus a little bit and tie my leadership journey into some of the things that have happened. And I would just say that it's been molded by really so many things, not the least of which is my upbringing. I like to tell people I was very fortunate. I hit the parent lottery, as I like to say. My parents didn't really have a lot of financial wealth, but they had a heck of a lot of wealth and support and love. And I think it really started from that. They're very hard-working people. And, the one thing that always hit me is that they appreciated people for who they were and not what they had. And that's probably because they didn't have that much themselves. And, I have to tell you that had an incredible impact on my leadership philosophy as time went on. As you said, I went to Penn State University and graduated in accounting, and I got out and I worked for the first 4 years at Price Waterhouse, which was a great opportunity for me. And then I went on to Harvard Business School, as you mentioned, and looking back on Harvard Business School, it's so funny because I still today wonder how in the heck I got in. I remember the first day looking around and seeing all these people, and I thought, you know what? I'm not sure. I might be the dumbest person in this room. I just don't know. And I found myself frankly digging deep. And I think I was hoping that the leadership wasn't all about brilliance, because if it was, I could see that there were a lot of captains of future captains of industry that were a lot brighter than me. But as you know, sometimes in an academic setting, it's a false laboratory. And I got out and I took my first job with a company called Trammell Crow Company in real estate, in development, real estate development. And it was there that I worked for a boss that I don't know that I've ever worked for a better boss in my life. And I just absolutely loved working for this guy. And he was fun. He was full of life. He cared for everybody that worked for them, generous with his time. But, at the end of the day, he just wanted us to be the best we could be. And he was devoted to make us the best that we could be. And I realized that success in the job is not about brilliance. I hearkened back to Harvard Business School. It was really more about how you treated people. And at the end of the day, how you influence people in your lives have a lot to do with your success. And I just believe that people work harder for leaders that care. And so, after that, I had plenty of things that affected me and affected that leadership journey. But I would say the most important one is the one I'll probably spend just a little bit more time on. And that is, as you started to mention, what happened to me at Prologis. And this was in the downturn. Roughly the years would be 2007 through 2012. And I really had a crucible moment. During that time, Prologis, really, I'd been there for about 15 years. Prologis had grown into a very large company over time, and as you mentioned, a member of the S&P 500 and the like. But and I had risen through the ranks through in an operational role, the chief financial officer to president, chief operating officer, and at that point in time, I was the number 2 person in the company, and I worked for a CEO who was one of the most brilliant people that I ever mentioned or that I ever met. But it was interesting. He believed that he was always right. He paid very little attention to what other people had to say. In some respects, he had narcissistic tendencies. And I think that caused him sometimes to twist the truth and withhold the truth. And it was really a tough environment. I mean, I really struggled with, how do I work with this person? And after about 3 or 4 years of doing it, I went to the board and I said, look, I think the CEO is running us over the cliff. I really do. And I don't know when it's going to happen, but I could see the culture changing. People were working in silos. They weren't communicating with one another because they were fearful about what the CEO would think. And is this something that he would agree to or not agree to? And then finally in January of 2008, I left the company. And as you mentioned, at that point in time, the company had a total market cap of a little over $20 billion. And we were trading at about $70 a share. And about 10 months later, just watching the stock go down and down and down, and it hit a low of $2.20 a share in November of 2008. And I got a call from the board of directors, and they said, Walt, we need to move on with the CEO that's here. You were right, and we'd like you to come back and run the company and turn around the company. And I have to tell you, I knew it was going to take a Herculean effort at that time. I mean, people had lost faith in management. They had lost faith in overall leadership. They lost confidence. But I tell you, I found out in retrospect, crucible moments are sometimes our best opportunities. And it was for me. And so over the next 4 years, I learned a lot about leadership in a very, very difficult time. And really that time is what inspired me to write the book, I would say, in general. It was what I learned during that time and during that turnaround that got me here, I think.
Interesting. I think that is so. By the way, fascinating story. I think that's something that we aspire to gain from someone who had taken that tough walk when things are not going. Like it's amazing. It's pretty much like pretty simple to run a company that's going on a hockey stick growth, but only when sort of things are on the reverse trend, how to bring it back. So I want us to spend more time on that particular aspect. So when you say join a company that is going haywire, right? That's going south and leadership has a problem, and then and you're absolutely right. So when things are not working, the trust starts sort of to evade. Many of the cultural fabric that at some point brought the company together is now, it's one of the worst enemy that the company needs to fight. So how would you or how would what were your some of the recipes that helped you indulge with that toxicity and trying to bring that company back? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, first of all, let's put it this way. When I didn't feel like I could be, when I exhausted all of my influence, I actually left the company. Candidly, if we harken back to early 2008, I did leave because I didn't feel like I could make that impact. So in all situations, some situations it's impossible. And I was feeling the weight of that impossibility in early 2008. But when I came back as the CEO of the company, I think we were able to change many of the things that the way that people thought about the business. And I personally believe it starts with you. All culture emanates from the top. It really does. And people watch a leader. And so from my perspective, I did a couple things. One, I think there's a real benefit to leaders overcoming their own fears and pride. The two most difficult things the leader has to deal with are fear and pride. Quite frankly, they're all about themselves. If they can get past that and they can become about other people, not about themselves, they can build trust. Because trust, you mentioned trust is the essence of leadership. If you can build trust, you can do a lot of great things. If you have no trust, it will break down. But building trust means that a leader needs to focus outside of themselves, not inside of themselves. It's very interesting. Harvard Business Review did an article a couple of years ago about fear. And they asked 116 C-level executives what it was that they feared the most. And you would have thought that they would have said, oh, they fear, their people leaving, or they fear not meeting their financial results, or no, in actuality, they feared other things. They feared underachievement. They feared being vulnerable and being politically attacked. I mean, there were all these things that came up about the things that they feared, and it was all about themselves. And when people see that in a leader, when they see that they can't operate outside of themselves, they're self-absorbed, you'll never build trust in an organization. So the first thing I think the whole management team had to do was just that. And there are other things that, you talk about transparency. We live in a world right now of glass houses where everything a leader does, everybody in the world can see. Everybody. And by the way, if you don't agree with me, just go on social media and some chat room and see what your employees are saying about you. Guess what? Somebody's commenting someplace about you, And so the only way that we combat this transparent world is to be transparent ourselves, incredibly open and transparent, which I think as a management team, we did. And so, there's overcoming your fears. There's dealing with transparency through being overly transparent. And then I think that you've got to lead with a strong core set of authentic values. I really do. I think people in the audience, if you will, your employees, need to know, what do you lead by? What do you stand for? I mean, what does this organization stand for? And what are the truths in this organization? And if we know what those truths are, and we know who you are, we can begin to believe you, and we can begin to trust you. And so those are some key overarching ideas that I think we brought to the organization that we're missing.
Interesting. I think I was thinking about one conversation I had with this one executive for one of the largest automaker during sort of the downturn times, and he was suggesting me, Vishal, you know what? When the market is going up, market is a lot more tolerant to whatever shenanigans you are putting together, right? They don't sort of, it's okay, you can do whatever, not much question asked. But when the markets start going south, you are pretty much becoming the puppet of your next quarterly call, and you're just, it's in a way the capitalist aspect or the market aspect of the business takes over. And now you are trying to sort of, and he was saying that it was an immense pressure for many of the businesses who are going through this downturn to justify their existence in the market, that they pretty much like it erode them to work sane through their normalcy when they used to, and they were focusing on building the business. So walk us through some of your perspective. Like, what did you see? So when you were at Prologis and you saw that impact, how do you come at peace with these two sort of conflicting forces? One is, okay, be progressive, think about the future, and the other is meet the numbers, otherwise it's the market is going to punish you. So how do you bring these two worlds together?
Okay. So, like you say, when the tide goes out, everybody's exposed. That's, I mean, when the water's in, you can hide a lot of things, but when the tide goes out, everybody's exposed, right? So you know what? Here's my point of view, and I'll give you an example. That's okay, and this is where transparency comes in. Let me give you an example of something that happened to me. So this was about 2 months on the job. I had come back November 2008. Okay, and I'm sitting there in a room, and all of my financial people are around me, my CFO, treasurer, and the whole entourage of finance people. And it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. I mean, we are working dog years, okay? And we're going home at 2 and we're getting back up at 6 and getting back in the office, So somebody says to me, and I can't remember, well, I just want you to know that I think probably next month, we're going to blow the covenants on $6 to $7 billion in bonds, blow our financial covenants. And I looked at him, I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, I don't see any other way around it, but we have to declare bankruptcy. Now, I had worked for the company before I came back for 15 years. And I had hired a lot of the people that were there, Vishal. So it was very difficult for me. And honestly, I turned white as a ghost. So I looked at everybody in the room. I said, do you guys mind if I just get some, I need some fresh air? And he said, no, that's fine, Walt. So I left the room. I walked down the hall and I'm feeling like I'm going to faint. Okay. And I turn and I see that there in this office there's a chair, and I start, quickly walking to the chair to sit down. And unfortunately I didn't make it. And I hit my head against the corner of the desk and split my head open. Okay. And I'm laying on the ground, and about 10 minutes later, I wake up and there's a puddle of blood there. And at first 30 seconds, I swear I didn't know where I was. And then all of a sudden, the first thing that hits me is, oh my God, I got 10 or more people in the room. They're still waiting for me to come back. They're probably wondering where I was. So I quickly go to the bathroom. I suture it up as best I could, get it to stop bleeding. I walk into the room and I said, well, let's start talking about this bankruptcy thing. And my CFO looks at me and he said, no, Walt, first let's talk about that egg on your head. How in the hell did that get there? Okay. And I got to tell you something. Talk about being exposed. That's what I just was talking. I mean, I felt like, I had nowhere to go. And I look at everybody in the room and I told them the story and I said, I fainted. I said, and you know why I fainted, guys? I got to tell you something. I don't have the answers. I don't have the answers. I was hired 2 months ago to be the CEO, and I don't know how to get out of this. And the only people that are going to help me figure this out is you. And what I thought, in looking back on it, I realized that there's actually power in vulnerability. There really is power in transparency and openness. Okay. And sometimes leaders have a difficult time doing it because you know what? They're the boss. They're supposed to have the answers. They're hired to turn it around, right? But in fact, the reality is the CEO doesn't turn it around. The CEO creates the environment to it being turned around, but the people in the organization are the ones that turn it around. And so what the CEO needs to do is empower people. And sometimes empowering people means you got to be vulnerable. And it means that you've got to be open and you got to share things that really are uncomfortable. Okay. But you know what happens when that happens? Everybody in the room that night felt empowered. They said, and the first thing they said to me is, Walt, you know what? Relax. We're going to figure this thing out. We don't expect you to figure this out. Just let us think about it. And guess what? They came up with the answer. I didn't come up with the answer. They did. And so this is I think it's a powerful lesson. I think it's so hard for CEOs and for leaders to put themselves aside, realize that the answers are really amongst all the people.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair. fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
That are around them and energize them to come up with the answers.
Interesting. I think that's fascinating. So, I think these are truly transformative times. Like we are all sitting at our homes, hoping to get out of this COVID phenomena, and many of the shops are closed. We are not looking at our books value the way we used to when things are working as they should. So once the economy open, and it's already impacting a lot of businesses, and we are seeing sort of it's like we are going in that turf where you joined this particular company. So what would you say to those people who are navigating these uncharted waters, or actually about to go in those uncharted waters? How would they react? How should they get into this when things are not working?
Okay. First of all, I would say this. A lot of people ask me, can you compare the 2008 financial crisis to this one? And I always say that actually you can't compare any crisis. No crisis is the same. But I actually believe the way you manage through crises are actually fairly similar. I would say that I think that this crisis, this COVID crisis, while things are getting better, I still think it's one of the toughest for managers that I've ever seen. And the reason I think that is because not only do we have financial difficulties in companies, but we have social difficulties in companies. If I think about 2008, yeah, everybody had financial issues, but they could still come to work each day and laugh with each other and, see each other and interact with each other. This is a little bit different. People are working remotely. They don't know how to cope with the challenges in their personal lives. They've got their kids to deal with in their schools. They got their parents. They got their own health, by the way, that they're worried about. And so there's real emotional issues out there. There really are. And I think, first of all, I don't have any easy solutions, but I think there's a couple things people should be aware of. Managers should be aware of. Number one, they have got to manage with a heart today. I mean, I talk a lot about heart, the importance of heart in my book. I think it's important that leaders ask and listen before they act today. I mean, I really, really think that it's all about up here listening. I think and the other thing is, I don't think you can expect people to come to you. I think people are harboring a lot of this stuff deep down inside of them. And I think leaders have to go to their people and ask questions as opposed to expecting their people to come to them. I think empathy and flexibility matter greatly in this environment. And so that's the first thing. I'd say the second thing is that I talk a lot in the book about the importance of delegating, trusting, and recognizing. If you want to build trust in any organization, you better start by trusting them, your people. But I think today, with people working so remotely in various locations, it's really hard to micromanage. And I hope leaders out there, those leaders that are micromanagers, are probably going crazy right now, because you just can't monitor. I can be with you for an hour, but when we hang up, I'm not watching you for the next 3 or 4, maybe 8 hours. I don't know. And there's dogs barking in the background of these calls, and there's babies crying, and there's Zoom calls that are just, it's crazy, So I think as a manager, you need to give people the freedom to do other things, like tend to their babies and like tend to their home life, because there's such a melding today between their business and their personal lives that if you expect to micromanage them, every minute of the day, you're going to drive them nuts. And so I think delegating and recognizing and trusting is critically important. And then I'd say the third thing is communicating. I mean, when I was at Prologis, the one thing I found out as a leader is that you have to communicate over and over and over. And you think everybody gets it the first time, and maybe 30% get it. And then the second time you communicate it, maybe you get it up to 50. And the third time, by that time, maybe you get to 90. But the fact of the matter is that you've got to over communicate with simple and relevant messages. I think that's critically important. The other thing that I think is important is you must avoid procrastination, especially in emails and correspondence like that. I think, people, when they're remote, they, they're not there next to you. They can't walk into your office and say, "Hey, I sent you an email X number, days ago. I never got a response." No, I mean, and people begin to wonder, well, they don't see you. I haven't heard from you. What does that mean? Does that mean I'm not doing a good job? I'm struggling with this. I think the whole remote nature just magnifies the communication aspect and the importance of getting back to people very quickly and communicating over and over and over. And so those are just some simple things that I see, and I hear about them on the boards that I'm on, and the management teams talking about them all the time. So, I mean, those are just some simple sort of practical COVID thoughts that I had.
Interesting. So I think so. You talk about being transparent. You talk about being vulnerable, showing that you are vulnerable. It's okay. People can relate with you. I think not a very common thought among the leaders, as even you're pointing it out, right? So it's radical. It's must have. And one of the interesting things. So I was talking to one of the investors from the investor circle in New York, and I was talking to him about, hey, why the market is going up when we know the shops are closed and we're not making as much the revenue that we're expecting. And he said that, Vishal, this time it's different because even traders have kids. Even they are stuck with their kids, right? So everyone is now having the same empathetic jolt that, okay, we are all in this together, right? So it's not that, yep, hey, some other city is going through this and we are here, so I can't relate. We all can relate to this particular problem. So with that thought, I think if I put sort of your sort of ideology on top of it, it gives an interesting opportunity to all the leaders, right? We are all empathetic because we all have to see our kids like 10 times a day. Many of us are not seeing, as you brightly pointed out, at our co-workers 8 hours out of 10, and now it's all trust and belief that I'm very uncomfortable with, that I have to somehow build inside me. So do you, like, from your vantage point, and you are managing a lot of companies and you're in a lot of companies boards conversations, do you even do you see this COVID opportunity as a wake up call, or at least as that soothing music that hopefully translate the leadership in ideology that you are pushing?
Yes, I actually do. I'm actually very optimistic. I saw a survey recently, and I can't tell you exactly where. I think it was Willis, where a lot of companies today are surveying their employees. I mean, that's one really great benefit. One board that I'm on is actually surveying the employees every other month and trying to get a sense for what their employees are thinking. And I saw a satisfaction survey recently, and I think it was from Willis, where they mentioned that over 80% of people surveyed are saying that their corporate culture is actually better, which is interesting to me. Now, that doesn't alleviate their stress that they have, but it does mean that I think managers are doing a better job of reaching out. I can just tell you that being on the board calls that I'm on, it is the topic du jour in all of my board calls. The boards are asking, well, geez, how is everybody? How's everybody doing? And you're hearing all these stories about, on one board I'm on, the company is actually helping people with their finances. On another board that I'm on, they're actually referring employees to various consultants that will, help them emotionally through some of the processes. As I said, they're being surveyed. I think, and in one case, one of the boards I'm on, they had to let go of a number of different people, and they actually gave their employees sensitivity training, if you can believe that, as to how to lay off people. I mean, these are things that you would have never seen in corporate America 10 years ago, at least certainly not in a broad brush basis. So in some respects, I think what you say is true. I think that companies have to be more sensitive to it. And, will it continue? I hope so. I hope we all learn from it. But that doesn't negate the difficulty, as I said, of the people on the other end and the things that they have to go through. I think it's really unprecedented times today. And I really think employers need to be very, very sensitive. And I think they are making a lot of strides.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
In that regard.
Interesting. And another thing that was fascinating about this conversation is, so you are from a CFO background going into a CEO. I think that's, again, so we spoke, many of the leaders that I've spoken with, they have, okay, CFOs, they just care about the bottom line and all that. So there's that sort of concept going on with them, and say, hey, I am the artist in this equation. He is the statistician in this equation. So now, like, looking at yourself coming from the CFO seat to out and in as a CEO, how has that journey been? Like, how is like, are you well equipped for it? And just walk us through that journey.
Well, that's hard. I would say, yeah, I had to make that transition. I definitely had to make that transition. But sometimes you can marry them together. I like to talk about examples. So let me give you something that happened at Prologis. So I remember a time where we had to, well, this is probably 3 or 4 months into my tenure there as CEO. We came to the decision in a management meeting, we were going to have to lay off about a third of our workforce. And a third of your workforce is tough. I mean, it's one thing when you lay off 5%, that might be fat, but when you get to 30%, you're laying off a lot of bone. And we laid off some really good people. And I can remember being in the management meeting, and we were all looking at the numbers as management people all do. And one of my associates said, hey, Walt, let's talk about the timing associated with when we tell people. And he said, we're going to probably need about 30 to 45 days to figure out who gets laid off. And I said, okay. And his next comment was, so we're going to need, let's not tell employees for 30 days. And I said, no, we can't do that. Now, the numbers part of me said, well, we need to get every number right. Okay. We need to get every person right. We need to do this perfectly. But then I realized that, the day before, I saw the somber look on all these people's faces. And let me tell you, there was a lot of water cooler talk around that. And even if there weren't water coolers, there were people talking right next to each other's offices a lot about, oh my God, what are we going to be laid off? And so people knew it was coming. And I remember thinking, that's not the way we build trust. The way we build trust is to get in front of our employees and tell them tomorrow that we're going to, now as a public company, we actually had to make a public announcement, but that meant we had to make a public announcement first, like immediately, and then meet with our employees. Okay. So we did that, and we took them through the math. Now I'm going to put my CFO hat on. There were people on the management team said, well, they're not going to really understand the math. I said, well, that doesn't matter. We have to show them the math. And we got up there, my CFO and I, and a couple others, we got up there for probably a half an hour to 45 minutes and took them through the math associated with, if we didn't lay off a third of the workforce, we weren't going to be around in a year. So what I'm trying to get at, Vishal, is that we had to marry the math. We had to marry the numbers with this whole notion of transparency and openness and building trust, right? And sometimes they are in conflict. Sometimes you can't be perfect about things. But I think what happened was, when we were transparent with people, and we actually told them that day, we said, by the way, we could have waited 30 days because we don't have the answers, but we did. And we told you today, we made the announcement today because we thought it was the right thing to do. And that in and of itself, trust in the organization, right? So sometimes you have to put the numbers aside. And I had to learn how to do that. I had to learn, put the perfectionist aside, put, what I thought was the right thing aside, and really try to have more of a heart for our people. I don't know if that example communicates, but that's what went through my head when you asked me that question.
No, I think absolutely. I think that's and thank you for sharing that. So now let's get on this fabulous book, Transfluence. So
Yeah.
tell us the premise behind this book, like why you wrote this book.
Okay. So the book is going to be published at the end of September, as you mentioned. Transfluence stands for Transformational Influence. I think as a leader, you got a lot of objectives to accomplish. Okay. My objective when I took over at Prologis was very simple: turn around the company, put it on a good financial footing. That was the objective that was communicated. And if you were to ask me what I got up thinking about every morning, it generally was that. But I began to learn that your most important objective is the influence you have on people. In other words, it's not about the result as much as it is about the journey. And if you get the journey right, you actually get the result right. But sometimes we don't put enough faith in that. And so I think it starts with understanding that it's not about you, but it's about the influence that you have on other people. It's about making other people better. Okay. So we started thinking about this concept, transformational influence. The more we talked about it, we said, oh, well, that's short for Tranfluence. And we looked up the word Tranfluence. I'm talking about literally how we did this. We looked it up and the definition of the word, there is actually a word. And the definition is water that runs through a stream, almost like a kind of something that flows through, like a stream would flow past you, right? And we start thinking, well, that's actually very similar to Transfluence because it flows from the heart of a leader. And so, you know, that's what Transfluence is. Transfluence starts with the notion that it is about building trust, that there is nothing more important in an organization. If you want to make a transformational influence on somebody's lives, if you want them to be the best they can be, it is all about building trust. Um, and then building trust gets back to the things that I talked about with you: overcoming your fear and pride, acting in a very transparent way, and leading with a strong core of authentic values, those sorts of things. I think all translate into what Transfluence is all about. It's leadership that builds trust in an organization. That's what we did in the turnaround at Prologis.
Interesting. And I think so when we talk about culture, right? So I remember that I don't know if I'm talking, I spoke with someone about transformation. And actually, this is one of the best definition that I got about transformation was that, hey, imagine this is a cruise ship, right? So, and you realize that there's a rock coming and you want to move left, right? So in cruise ships business, if you see a rock, you're already late, right? So probably you should rotate the rudder, and then maybe in couple of hours late you see the ship moves. And when you run a bigger companies, right? So that's the culture, right? So it's not, if I realize something is missing, I just induce my impacts and then take a leap of faith, and then probably in a couple of months we see something making an impact, and that becomes sort of one of the most frustrating part when it comes to sort of transformatively changing an organization.
Yes.
What do you think, and what's your resolve, or what do you suggest about that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think that things change overnight. One thing I found though is that, and just to put things into context, obviously I was going through a crisis, but we're going through a crisis today too. And one thing I found in a crisis is that people are even more attentive to leadership than they are when you're not in a crisis. When things are actually going well, they're distracted. Believe it or not, when people are in a crisis, even though they're distracted, they're highly focused on you as a leader. And so I actually think if you lead by example, if you tell them how you're going to lead, and then you lead by that example, okay, I think that their antennas are up, and I think you have a better opportunity to actually influence the culture in the organization because people's antennas are up. Does that make sense? Um, and so that's what I saw, and that's what I see during a crisis. And so I want to interject another story that I think was really important to me. It actually had a real impact on me. Um, Again, a couple months into my leadership tenure, I got a call from an investment banker who was from Morgan Stanley. And he's, and by the way, the Wall Street Journal ran an article on us, a front page article talking about how we were, maybe the next real estate company to go bankrupt and blah, blah, blah. And so, the cat was out of the bag. Obviously, our share price was down 96%. So our investors knew that was going to have thought that was going to happen too. Anyway, my investment banker friend said, Walt, would you like to talk to John Mack, who was the CEO of Morgan Stanley at the time? And by the way, John Mack was a revered CEO. I mean, very, very much loved by his people. And John said to me, and so I said, yes, I'll do it. So I got on with John, and I said, John, I read a lot in the papers about how the Fed and the Treasury Secretary are trying to jam you guys together, maybe with another bank out there. And I know you're dealing with all this stuff, but that's not what I'm concerned about. What I want to know is how you're managing your people. He said to me, oh my gosh, he said, well, Walt, he said, haven't always been the greatest manager, but I've learned over the years to manage the business on the basis of the 3 H's. And I said, what the heck is that? And he said, I think the best leaders in the world are humble. He said, I think the best leaders in the world are honest. And he said, in this day and age, I think a banker needs to have a sense of humor. In other words, you got to have some humor about you. And I struggled with that word humor because I'm not the funniest guy in the world. But I think what John was really saying is that you need to have a human side of you. People need to be able to relate to you, right? And if that means cracking a joke, great. But and so I started, and one of the things I write about in this book is the value of what I call a 3H core, and that is, what does it mean as a leader to be humble? What does it mean to be honest? And what does it mean to be human? And so when I talk about a crisis, and I talk about how you need to have a strong set of authentic values, and to answer your question, when I talk about how you change a culture and what you want people to emulate, that's what I think I want people to emulate. That's what I began to think I wanted people to know me by. I wanted to have a level of humility. I wanted to be brutally honest and transparent. And I wanted to have a heart for them. I wanted to show them that I cared. And I wasn't always successful at it. I can tell you instances where I wasn't. But I think over time, when people see that, they actually begin to emulate that. It doesn't happen overnight, as you said. It doesn't happen even in a month or two. It happens over a year or two. It should happen by a year, I think, or two. People begin to realize that that's the way they have to act. If Walt acts that way, or if the management team acts that way, I've got to act that way, And so it does happen. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens.
Interesting. So if you wear your CFO hat and say if you look around the industry as such, right? So if you look around, how many companies and leaders are there who are not transparent, who are sort of very in their bubbles, trying to do their things, managing their stock prices well, beating expectations, and vis-a-vis some of the role models that are out there today, which we sort of aspire to when it comes to transparency and leadership, and sort of we look at that, and you see that the company with no transparency or limited transparency, statistically they are more than company who are like pretty much like very radical when it comes to being transparent and understanding, like showing the market what they stand for and all that. What would you, so if you wear a skeptic's hat, right? So what would you say to the skeptic, saying, okay, the number speaks, right? So that side is also has far better successes. Why should I come this way? What would you tell to those skeptics?
Well, I would say that I've never made the statement that if you aren't, then you will never be. In other words, if you aren't transparent, if you don't lead with a heart, then you will never be successful. I will never make that statement. There's a lot of companies out there that have been successful over time, that have had command and control leadership styles. They're just it. I mean, so I'm not saying that. I guess what I'm saying is this, Michelle, and that is that best example I can give you is if I go back to 1979, which is going back a long time. Okay. But I took my first job out of college. Leadership was command and control. I was happy to be employed. Leadership paid little attention to culture. Um, you know, people were less critical back then. There was no social media. They were less vocal. Basically, my job was more transactional. The truth of the matter is that I collected a paycheck. I needed a job, and they needed me to do a job. Okay, that was leadership. Let me compare and contrast that to the day I took over as CEO. Okay, when I took over, I probably received nearly 1,000 calls, emails, texts from everybody from equity and bond investors to sell side analysts to rating agencies to news publications to my employees to my board. Okay. There were online chats that were rampant about our future and my leadership. Could I do it? Couldn't I do it? I mean, everything is so exposed today. The world is changing really rapidly. Okay. And people expect more from leaders today. They just do. By the way, CEOs now last less than 5 years in their job. Some of that's by choice, and some of that is because they're being let go of. Okay. And so we live in a world with greater access to information, more diversity in people, but also in geography, in where they work, with accelerating progress. Okay. And the fact of the matter is these are changing climates. I talk about this in my book too. I just think it's changing climates. And I'm not saying that kind of command and control leadership can't be successful, but I think increasingly the odds are less and less and less. And I think, we've got fewer face-to-face interactions today. We've got an overabundance of false narratives to manage through. We have more voices to be heard. We have a more distributed workforce. We can go on and on and on about this. And companies, I just think that the old model is going to become older and older and older over time. I think leadership today requires a more constant drumbeat of honest and open communication. I think it requires values-based leadership, and it requires leadership with a heart. And people notice that. And yeah, our unemployment rate is higher today, so people need a job. But let me tell you, get back down to 3% unemployment, and people have choices, and they hop in companies like that. You want to hire good talent, that's the way you got to manage. And that's why it's so important to me to talk about it, because I think future leaders have to understand that this is the future. I truly believe it is.
Interesting. So another thought. So I was speaking with one of the mid-size apparel companies CEO, and he was telling me he sells sports apparels, and he told me an interesting story. He said, Vishal, whenever every night or every evening I make a rule to just take a walk and look at his school, like school playgrounds, and look at kids using the sports apparel products. You just see, because his perspective was that as a leader, many times I just only see the stats. I only see numbers, right? I don't see that there are real people behind that number, right? And he said that this particular thing keeps me sane, because many times I fail to connect the two things together, like why that number, and many times number doesn't tell me the complete story that the particular thing is saying. What do you think about that story?
I love it. For me, every morning I get up and I spend, some people would say meditation. I'll just say it's prayer, but I spend between a half an hour and an hour just sitting down, and before I answer my first email, I just think. And in my case, I pray. And I'm not saying that your listeners should be prayers out there. Everybody has their own religious beliefs, but I will say that I think that it is critically important for leaders to step back and smell the roses a little bit, but also realize what they have, realize their blessings, realize that there are other things that are going on around them than their problems. And I think that however you choose to do that, in my case, it's in prayer in the morning. But I think that's powerful. I really think it's powerful. And I don't, I talk a little bit about that in the book, but I don't want to go down the path of thinking, having people think that that's the only solution. It's not, but it certainly fits in. It fits into the toolbox. That's for sure.
Interesting. And you also talk about, say, culture, right? It's all about changing culture. And I think if you see in your basically Prologis story, your 8-month older self, right, was frustrated at not being able, and you said that you have exhausted all your influence on the company, and then you left the company, then you came back, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yes. So if you look back on, or if you say take for an example an leader today who is like pretty much in your shoe, exhausted all the influence, the ball is not moving, what do you advise to those guys? Because changing culture is really hard. And if you have a strong culture, because many of the problem is not really lack of it, it's too much of it, or not ability, not more agility in it. So what would you advise to those leaders who are struggling and just saying, oh, maybe let me look outside the window now?
Wow. You have to put yourself into each person's situation. I think it is, look, I left once. And there might be a time and place to leave. I mean, in other words, if you look around and you say, I can't do anything more, or more importantly, from my perspective, I don't enjoy the person I work with. I don't think that person will ever get it. It may be the right thing to leave. It was the right thing for me in 2008 to leave. But I would say this, I think jobs should be fun. People should enjoy the things that they do. And if they're not enjoying the things that they do, and by the way, the number one reason people don't enjoy what they do tends to be their manager. There's all kinds of surveys that will say that. It's not how much they get paid. It's their manager. And so if you don't feel like you can make that kind of impact and that kind of change, then I get the fact that maybe their job isn't right. We all should have fun. I wasn't having fun in 2008, but this book is not just about, and what I have to say is not just about leading in the business sense. We're all leaders. We're all leaders. And you think about it, you're leading by having this podcast, we lead our families. We lead our neighbors. We lead the people that are around us, right? And so even if you were to leave your job because you don't feel like you can make an impact there, don't underestimate the fact that you're still leading in everything you do. And your job we ought to be spending more time thinking about the people around us, our wife, in my case, my kids, my neighbors, and how do I lead? What kind of person am I around them too, right? And so I think in many respects, what I have to say relates to your personal life as well as your business life, although the context of it is much more focused on the business side.
Interesting. And slightly on the funnier side of things. So one of the leaders that I spoke to, he put it in a very interesting way. He said, Vishal, many of the employees look at their companies as their girlfriends. Okay, so the shiny thing now, maybe going off to the next, so they're always hunting for the next shinier girlfriend in their journey. And he said that, and if you talk about the leadership, they should, like many of the people who are actually transformative in nature, they look at the company as their kids, right? They're stuck with it, so they have to, they should better fix it, right? So, and he said that. And you pointed out that the CEO is now getting 5-year tenure, like the typical tenure is now 5 years, and it's shrinking. It's shrinking. So now with that in mind, right? So it doesn't give you too much time to enjoy your kid, and pretty much like push you to just date, right? So how would you see this whole thing turn out? And what's your thinking about this?
Well, I was a CEO for, I think, 4 years or so, maybe 4.5 years, something like that. But I I was the president and chief operating officer for 4 years before that. I was the chief financial officer for 6 years before that. And in all of those roles, I mean, you don't have to be a C-suite executive to lead people. I mean, and before that, I was a regional director and I was leading people. And so it's not just the CEO, it's wherever you are. You have to realize that you're always leading people. Even if you're leading sideways, even if you look at your peers, you're leading people. And our goal ought to be to make those people better. So yes, I think the tenure of a CEO is shorter because it's much more brain damage today, and there's a lot more pressure for sure. But I think that that doesn't negate the fact that we're leaders most of our lives, and we need to be cognizant of the tools that it takes to build trust, because all of us have a goal in mind. Sometimes it's a financial goal, sometimes it's other. But if you want to reach that goal, you got to build trust. You have to build trust above you, below you, sideways to yourself, and the like. And the more trust you build, the more successful you'll be.
Interesting. So about this book, right? So when you were writing this book, who is the ideal reader? Like who is it? Who is this book written for?
Right. I get asked that all the time, and I would say that it's a leadership book. So anybody that feels they're leading in whatever capacity, it works for them. I like to think that a large majority of the readers will be emerging leaders, will be leaders that not have led for 20 or 30 years, because I think most of those people truly believe they may be seeking things that they on the margin that they can do better. But most people have their recipe by then. I think in some respects, the emerging leader is really trying to figure out, how do I run my company a little bit better? Or how do I lead this flock of people that I have a little bit better? There are people that are more open, I think, to this type of leadership. And so I would say that's probably the number one group of people. But I do think it's applicable in many cases to almost everything that we do in life.
Interesting. No, I think I do appreciate this book. I think because you rightly pointed out, this is the best time for something like this emerge. And
Yeah.
I some like because we all are living in transformative time, and I think this something when anyone share their perspective, I think I do appreciate that for sure, because we need to see what has some of the leaders have done in their times, and because we are seeing these things front end. So now let's spend on some of your personal journey. And by the way, thank you so much for being really candid about the book and your prologous background. So we ask all of our guests to share some of the qualities, some of the traits that has really helped them be successful and be what they are. Like, what would you attribute your success to? Which qualities that has really helped you become what you are?
Boy, um, I talked a lot about my upbringing. I truly believe my parents had a lot to do with the things that the way that I lead. I talked a lot about my boss at Trammell Crow Company and how he's influenced me. I think that the tidbits that I would give to people would be, I really think that the more we can work on being less about ourselves and more about others, the better off we can be. And I would just say that there was a coach in my life when I was at Prologis that I hired to coach the whole management team. And one time, and he did extensive 360-degree evaluations of us and personality tests, everything. Okay. And I got back and I met with him the first time, and he said, well, first of all, let me give you the good news. The good news is a lot of people like working for you. He said, the bad news is that your empathy scores are not all that high. I said, what? What do you mean my empathy? I mean, I care for people. He said, no, well, your empathy scores are not that high. And he said, the reason is because people like working for you, but they watch you running around like a chicken with your head cut off in the office. You fear not succeeding, but your relationships are suffering as a result of it. You need to spend more time with your people. And it was like a dagger in my heart. But let me tell you something. Um, Having a coach, having a personal board of directors, having an accountability group, but having somebody that is willing to be brutally honest about you and watch what you do is actually quite important, I think, in life. In other words, it's not just the people we emulate, but I also think it's the people that are willing to tell us what we can do better and truly take an interest in us. In my case, I had to hire somebody to do it, but I'm going to tell you something. I learned a lot, and I actually changed my management style. I tweaked it, is probably a better way of saying it, to appear more empathetic and also to become more empathetic over time. And so the advice I would give to people is that I think you got to look outside of yourself, and sometimes it takes somebody outside of yourself to tell you what you need to do. In my case, that's what I did.
Interesting, and thank you for sharing that. By the way, I think that's really having a coach is. I think it's. I truly believe it's appropriate. I think thank you for sharing that. Some of the books that has really influenced you. So if suppose, or some of the books that you are reading right now, we ask all of our guests to share some of their favorite reads. Like, what would you call them? Like, what are some of those you can share?
Yeah. So you might think that I will list a bunch of leadership books, but many of the books, by the way, the one behind you, Conscious Capitalism, I love. I've read that book. That's a fantastic book. But many of them, and that was written by a CEO, but many of them are not written by CEOs. They're written by consultants who haven't lived it. And so I have a bias. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of great leadership books that are written by consultants, but I have a bias. I like to read people that have actually gone through the war. And so I actually enjoy leadership history books that talk about presidents. Um, David McCulloch's books on Truman, David McCulloch's book on Adams, 1776, which talks about Washington and how he handled, the difficult times. Those books to me are terrific. They're leadership books. They're truly, and they're not autobiographies, but they are biographies about, I think, great leaders who shaped this country. And then there were two really impactful books that I read a long time ago that truly impacted sort of what I do today. And that is, I read a book by Bob Buford, and the name of the book was Halftime. And Bob talks in the book, he's passed away since this, but the tagline of the book is taking your career from success to significance. And I oftentimes thought in the last, he talks about in the book that you have two times in your life. You have the first half and you have the second half. And the first half is all about building your career and sending your kids to college and so forth and so on. The second half is about giving back. And take your career from success to significance. So that had a real impact on my life and kind of what I do today. I'm writing the book and talking to people about what I think real leadership is. And then there was another book that I read called The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren, who's a pastor. But Rick Warren writes a lot about purpose, that we all have a purpose and we should be looking to what that purpose is, and that we all crave meaning in our lives. And both of those books were really impactful to me.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Some of the good list there. So now we're at the last question. So as a closing remark, like what would be your parting thought? What would you, if our listeners and viewers would take away something from our conversation, what would that be?
So I would say this, Vishal. First of all, I would thank you for having me on the show. But I would say, I think too often we define success the wrong way, or in a very narrow way, right? I mean, we watch sports and we ask who won. We say that the stocks that have outperformed are quote unquote winners and others are losers. And so, for me, I like to turn that around. I would say, and by the way, my measure of success was, did Walt turn around the company? Okay. But I think that, so sometimes we define success too much by results and we don't define it enough by the journey. And I would just leave your listeners with this. I don't only focus on the results. The journey of getting there also matters. And part of that journey is the influence that you have on other people. You might hit your results, but if people have a bad taste about how you did it, I don't think you've succeeded. I really think it's the influence you have on other people that is the long lasting, the thing that that lives. It's a gift that just keeps giving. And so think about your journey. Think about your leadership journey, not just the results in getting there. That's what I would leave people with.
Beautifully put. And with that, thank you so much, Walt. And again, I do appreciate your effort in writing this book. I think, as I said before, this is truly a transformative time, as we all agree. And we need a voice of reason. We need some of the leaders to come out and talk about their journey and what they did, because we need as many playbooks as are made available. And I do appreciate every effort that you're doing to, number one, serve back, number two, tell us how you survived during your turmoils. And thank you, and wish you nothing but success in your journey and the book. You're always welcome back on the podcast. Love to have you back sometime in future talking about the success of this book and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Vishal, and thanks for having me. It has been an honor, and it has been an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the